In the sweltering summer heat, a young boy wearing a wool muffler made a silent hand signal no one noticed, except the Royal Guard. Seconds later, the Guard broke 352 years of protocol, stopped the stepmother cold, and what followed exposed a dark secret that left tourists frozen in disbelief. Want to know why? First, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. That being said, let's get into it. The summer sun beat down on the ancient stones of the Tower of London as tourists gathered in anticipation of witnessing centuries of tradition embodied by the Royal Guards. Among them stood Guard Edward Winslow, his scarlet uniform immaculate, his posture unwavering despite the heat that made the heavy bearskin cap feel twice its normal weight. At 34, Edward was no ceremonial soldier playing dress-up. The ribbon bar, partially visible beneath his tunic, told a story few tourists bothered to learn. 3 tours in Afghanistan, distinguished service medals, and the quiet confidence of a man who had faced real danger. His left shoulder bore a scar from a firefight outside Kabul, where he'd shielded a local child from insurgent fire, an incident that had earned him one of those medals and reinforced his instinctive drive to protect the vulnerable. During his military career, Edward had developed a reputation for noticing what others missed. The subtle shift in a crowd's energy before an attack, the out-of-place object that signaled danger. Those same eyes, trained to spot threats in dusty village marketplaces and mountain passes, now scanned the tourist crowds with identical vigilance. Edward had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours when something unusual caught his attention. A boy of about 11 had entered the courtyard alongside a slender blonde woman. Unlike the other children who bounded energetically around their parents, this boy, thin, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead, moved with unnatural precision, as if navigating a minefield rather than a historic attraction. Most peculiar was his attire. While other tourists had dressed for the unseasonably warm day in t-shirts and shorts, the boy wore long sleeves and, most strikingly, a thick woolen muffler wrapped around his neck, despite the heat that had most visitors fanning themselves. The woman, presumably his mother, kept a hand firmly on the boy's shoulder, her manicured nails digging in slightly with each adjustment to his posture or movement. When she smiled at passing tourists, her expression was warm and engaging, but when she turned to the boy, something hardened in her eyes that Edward recognized from years of reading potentially hostile situations. "Ryan, stay closer," Edward heard her say, the pleasant tone barely masking an undercurrent that made the boy immediately step back in line. Years of combat had taught Edward to notice the disconnect between words and body language. The boy's eyes continuously scanned his surroundings, not with the curiosity typical of children his age, but with the hypervigilance of someone mapping escape routes and monitoring threats. The Queen's Guard aren't just ceremonial figures, the tour guide explained to her captivated audience. They're active duty soldiers, many with combat experience. Their stillness isn't just tradition. It's a demonstration of the discipline that defines Britain's elite forces. Edward maintained his forward gaze as the group stopped near his post, but his peripheral vision tracked Ryan's movements with practiced precision. The boy had been glancing at the guards with growing interest, a flicker of something, perhaps admiration or curiosity, momentarily breaking through his carefully maintained mask of compliance. Elaine noticed immediately, her fingers tightening on Ryan's shoulder. "Stop staring," she whispered, her lips barely moving while her public smile remained fixed in place. "Remember what happens when you draw attention." Ryan's response was instant. Eyes down, shoulders hunched, the brief spark of childlike interest extinguished like a candle in wind. His small hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together, a practiced gesture that Edward recognized from trauma victims he'd encountered in war zones, a self-soothing mechanism born of regular fear. When Ryan shifted position, His collar slipped slightly, revealing a yellowish-purple bruise peeking above his muffler, the discoloration clearly displaying the distinctive pattern of adult fingers. He quickly adjusted the wool garment, despite sweat beading on his forehead from the summer heat, his movements carrying the efficiency of someone who had learned precisely how to hide evidence of abuse from prying eyes. An elderly couple standing nearby noticed the exchange. Their concerned glances exchanged silently over Ryan's head. The woman moved slightly closer. "It's quite warm for such a heavy scarf, isn't it, dear?" she commented gently to Ryan. "Are you feeling unwell?" Before Ryan could respond, Elaine smoothly intercepted. "He has a throat condition. The doctor insists he keep it covered, even in this heat. Such a burden for him, poor thing." Her hand squeezed Ryan's shoulder as she spoke. To outsiders, perhaps a gesture of maternal comfort, but Edward noted the boy's almost imperceptible wince. The elderly woman's husband frowned slightly. "My grandson had strep last month. What condition does your boy have, if you don't mind my asking?" A flash of annoyance crossed Elaine's face before her practiced smile reasserted itself. "It's quite complicated, autoimmune related. We've had quite the medical journey, haven't we, Ryan?" Ryan nodded dutifully, but when Elaine turned to answer another question, Edward caught the boy's eyes darting nervously between his mother and the royal guard. As the tour continued, Edward observed a pattern emerging. Whenever Ryan showed interest in his surroundings or responded directly to others, Elaine would immediately redirect with a combination of gentle public corrections and whispered private warnings. Each time, Ryan's behavior would reset to perfect unnatural compliance. When the tour guide led the group toward the Crown Jewels exhibition, the crowd shifted, creating momentary separation between Ryan and Elaine. A family with 3 boisterous teenagers moved between them, providing Ryan with seconds of visual cover from his mother's watchful gaze. In that brief window, Ryan's eyes locked with Edward's, no longer the fleeting glances of before, but deliberate, intentional contact. A memory flashed through Ryan's mind, 6 months earlier, sitting cross-legged on the gymnasium floor as a police officer addressed his school assembly. "If you're ever in danger and can't speak freely," the officer had explained, "there's a signal you can use to tell an adult you need help." The officer had demonstrated a simple hand gesture, palm raised, fingers extended, then folded into a fist. "This means I'm in danger. Please help me." Police officers, soldiers, teachers, they're all trained to recognize this signal. Now, with Elaine momentarily blocked from view, Ryan raised his hand to chest level, fingers extended. His eyes never left Edward's as he deliberately folded his fingers into a fist, then opened his palm again. The universal distress signal taught to children across the country. Edward's expression remained impassive, as required by his duties, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly in recognition. The British Armed Forces had implemented mandatory training on recognizing signs of domestic abuse and child endangerment just 18 months prior. The hand signal was part of that training, alongside other indicators that Edward had been mentally cataloguing since the pair entered the courtyard. Just as Ryan completed the signal, Elaine pushed through the family, separating them, her practiced smile barely concealing her irritation. "Ryan, stay where I can see you," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear the maternal concern in her voice. But as she gripped his shoulder, her fingers digging in painfully, she whispered, "What were you doing with your hand? Who were you signalling?" Ryan's face drained of colour. Nothing. I was just—" "Don't lie to me," Elaine hissed, her mouth close to his ear, while her expression remained pleasantly neutral to onlookers. "You think I don't see everything you do? When we get home, you'll wish you'd never been born." "I'm sorry," he whispered automatically, fear closing his throat. "It won't happen again." "It certainly won't," Elaine agreed, her voice dropping to a register that sent ice through Ryan's veins. "Because we're leaving. Now. We're leaving. I've had enough of your behaviour today," Elaine announced loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear, her public persona firmly in place, despite the vice-like grip she maintained on Ryan's arm. As she yanked him forward, the sudden movement caused Ryan's carefully arranged hair to shift, momentarily revealing the edge of a purple-black bruise surrounding his left eye, before he hurriedly brushed his hair back into place. A young couple standing nearby noticed immediately. "Did you see that?" the woman whispered to her partner. "That boy has a black eye." Her partner frowned, lowering his camera. "And have you seen how she's grabbing him? That can't be right." Elaine's smile faltered momentarily before reasserting itself with forced brightness. "Come along, Ryan! We'll miss our bus," she insisted, pulling him more quickly toward the exit. Ryan stumbled, trying to keep pace with her increasingly agitated movements. The crowd had thickened near the exit, forcing them to slow down. With each pause, more tourists noticed the disconnect between Elaine's public pleasantries and the frightened compliance of the boy she gripped so tightly. Edward remained at his post, his exterior a perfect example of the guard's legendary discipline, but his mind was racing with combat-honed calculations. Each second that passed presented more evidence confirming what the boy's distress signal had communicated. An elderly man with a walking stick deliberately stepped into Elaine's path, forcing her to stop abruptly. "Pardon me, young lady, but is your son all right? He seems distressed." "He's fine," Elaine replied curtly, her facade of pleasantness wearing thin. "And we're in a hurry." The elderly man didn't move. "I was a schoolteacher for 40 years. I learned to recognize when a child isn't fine." More tourists had stopped to observe the interaction. The crowd's collective attention now focused on the woman and the boy. Elaine's eyes darted around, noting the growing number of witnesses with increasing agitation. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, attempting to push past the elderly man. "My son has behavioral issues. We're leaving because he's been disruptive." "I haven't seen him disrupt anything," remarked a woman with a tour guide badge. "He's been exceptionally quiet, actually." Sensing her control of the situation slipping, Elaine jerked Ryan forward with enough force that he gasped audibly in pain. The sudden movement caused him to lose his balance, and as he stumbled, he instinctively reached out to steady himself against a nearby barrier. The motion pulled his arm from his mother's grip and sent the woolen muffler sliding from his neck. There was an audible collective intake of breath from the nearest onlookers as a ring of dark bruises, unmistakably in the pattern of adult fingertips, became visible around Ryan's throat. "Oh my God!" someone whispered. A woman covered her mouth in shock. Ryan frantically grabbed for the muffler, his eyes wide with terror as he realized what had been revealed. Before he could cover himself again, the elderly man's wife had stepped forward, placing herself somewhat between the boy and Elaine. "Young man," she said gently, "did someone hurt you?" Elaine lunged forward, grabbing Ryan's arm again. "He falls a lot," she said sharply. "He's very clumsy. Tell them, Ryan." Ryan's mouth opened, but no words came out. Years of conditioned obedience warring with the desperate hope that help might actually be possible. His eyes darted to Edward, still standing at his post 20 feet away, then back to the ring of concerned faces surrounding him. "Tell them!" Elaine demanded, her composed mask slipping further as she gave him a shake that rattled his thin frame. Sensing her control evaporating completely, Elaine made a desperate decision. "We're leaving, now." She grabbed Ryan roughly by both arms and began physically dragging him toward the exit, pushing past the elderly couple despite their protests. "Someone stop her!" called out the young woman who had first noticed Ryan's black eye. "She's hurting him!" Edward watched as Ryan cast one final, desperate look in his direction, a child's last plea for rescue before being dragged back into darkness. In that moment, with that look, Edward Winslow's decision was made. For 352 years, the Queen's Guard had maintained their legendary discipline, standing motionless through rain, snow, tourist provocations, and even occasional physical contact. Breaking formation without direct orders was perhaps the most serious breach of protocol possible, a potentially career-ending move. Edward Winslow made his decision in the space between heartbeats. With military precision that transformed ceremonial stillness into controlled action, Edward stepped from his post. The crisp sound of his boot striking stone echoed across the suddenly hushed courtyard as tourists gasped and raised phones to capture the unprecedented event. His movement was not the uncertain step of someone making a mistake or the hesitant shuffle of someone questioning their decision. Edward moved with the focused intensity of a combat soldier, responding to an identified threat, his stride purposeful and direct. "Oh my God! He's moving," someone whispered loudly as the crowd parted instinctively before him. Elaine, still dragging Ryan toward the exit, froze as she realized what was happening. The Royal Guard, the supposedly ceremonial figure she had dismissed as mere tourist entertainment, was advancing toward her with undisguised purpose, his face set in controlled but unmistakable anger. "Ryan, come on!" she hissed, yanking the boy's arm hard enough that he cried out in pain. The sound of the child's distress crystallized Edward's resolve. His military training had conditioned him to protect the vulnerable, and no ceremonial duty could override the fundamental moral obligation now driving him forward. "Ma'am," Edward's voice carried the weight of battlefield command, cutting through the courtyard noise with authority that stopped Elaine in her tracks. "Release the boy, now!" "This is none of your business," Elaine shot back, attempting to drag Ryan behind her. "He's my son." "Your stepson," Ryan corrected automatically, in a barely audible whisper, immediately cringing as Elaine's fingers dug deeper into his arm. Edward closed the remaining distance between them in 3 measured strides, positioning himself directly in front of Elaine. Up close, his height and military bearing made Elaine take an instinctive step back. "I observed a recognized distress signal," Edward stated, his voice level, but carrying an edge that made nearby tourists fall completely silent. "I am obligated to respond." "Distress signal?" Elaine forced a laugh, looking around at the gathered crowd, as if inviting them to share her amusement. "This is ridiculous. He was just waving or something. Tell him, Ryan." Ryan stared at the ground, his thin shoulders hunched in anticipation of consequences. "Young man," Edward addressed Ryan directly, his tone shifting to something gentler, though no less authoritative. "Did you intentionally signal for help?" The courtyard seemed to hold its collective breath. Security personnel had reached the edges of the crowd, but paused, assessing the Royal Guard's intervention before determining how to proceed. "Answer the question, son," Edward said, his eyes never leaving Ryan's face. "No one will hurt you for telling the truth." The promise, simple but powerful, hung in the air between them. For Ryan, who had survived the past year by becoming expert at reading adults' intentions, something in the guard's unwavering gaze communicated absolute certainty. This man would not back down. This man would not fail him. "Yes," he whispered, then stronger. "Yes, I did." Elaine's face contorted with fury. "You little liar!" She raised her hand reflexively, decades of self-control abandoning her in a moment of uncalculated rage. The slap never landed. Edward's response was so swift and controlled that many in the crowd didn't register the movement until it was complete. His hand intercepting Elaine's mid-strike, his grip firm, but applying only the precise pressure necessary to prevent harm. "That," Edward said, his voice carrying the cold precision of a soldier who has moved beyond anger to something more dangerous, "was a mistake." Tower security quickly created a perimeter around the area, gently moving tourists back while medical personnel arrived on scene. Edward remained beside Ryan, his ceremonial stillness now transformed into a protective presence as Elaine continued her increasingly desperate attempts to regain control of the situation. "This is a complete misunderstanding," she insisted to the female security officer who had taken primary control. "Ryan has behavioral issues. He makes up stories for attention." The security officer regarded Elaine skeptically before turning to the medical technician, who was carefully documenting Ryan's injuries. Multiple contusions at various healing stages, the technician reported quietly, her professional demeanour barely concealing her shock at the extent of the injuries. The pattern on his neck is consistent with adult finger marks applied with significant force, a classic strangulation attempt. The bruising on his arms appears to be from restraint holds, and there's evidence of healed fractures in 2 fingers of his right hand that weren't properly set. She pointed to subtle markings on her documentation. What's particularly concerning is the systematic nature of these injuries. They're deliberately placed in areas typically covered by clothing. This isn't random abuse. It's calculated to avoid detection. She lowered her voice further. In my 15 years of emergency medicine, this is among the more severe cases of ongoing child abuse I have documented. Elaine heard enough to shift tactics. He falls constantly, she explained, forcing her voice back into the concerned maternal register. He has a medical condition that affects his balance. My dad died last year, Ryan interrupted, his voice small but suddenly clear. The courtyard fell silent as he continued. She married my mum 4 months later. After Mum died too, the bruises started. The simple statement, delivered with a child's devastating directness, sent murmurs through the watching crowd. Elaine's face drained of colour. That's not true, she sputtered, but the practised confidence had evaporated from her voice. The elderly man who had initially intervened stepped forward. My wife and I observed this woman threatening the boy multiple times, he stated firmly. She repeatedly used physical force that went well beyond appropriate guidance. We have it on video, added the young woman who had first noticed Ryan's black eye, holding up her phone. I started recording when I saw how she was treating him. Throughout this exchange, Edward had maintained his position beside Ryan, who seemed to draw strength from the guard's unwavering presence. When a female paramedic approached to check Ryan's vital signs, Edward stepped back slightly, but remained within Ryan's line of sight. You're doing very brave work, young man, the paramedic told Ryan as she gently checked his pulse. Can you tell me if you hurt anywhere else that we can't see? Ryan hesitated, glancing at Edward, who gave him a slight, encouraging nod. My ribs, Ryan admitted quietly, from when I fell down the stairs 2 weeks ago. The way he said fell made it clear to everyone listening that no accident had occurred. As Elaine was being led away by police officers, still protesting her innocence, she looked back at Ryan with an expression that made the boy instinctively step closer to Edward. This isn't over, she called out. When they realise what a liar you are, you'll come home, and then... That's enough, the officer interrupted firmly. One more threat to the child, and I'll be adding witness intimidation to the charges. Ryan watched her disappear through the archway, his expression a complex mixture of relief, disbelief, and lingering fear. When she was finally out of sight, his shoulders slumped as if a massive weight had been lifted. Is she really gone? He asked Edward, his voice barely above a whisper. She is, Edward confirmed, and you won't be going back to her. The female security officer approached them, her expression softening as she addressed Ryan. We've contacted social services, she explained gently. They'll be arranging emergency placement for you while everything gets sorted out. Fear flashed across Ryan's face. Foster care? Elaine said foster homes are terrible places where people only take kids for money. That's not true, the officer assured him. And actually, we've reached out to your father's parents. Did you know they've been trying to find you? Ryan's eyes widened. My grandparents? Elaine said they didn't want me. According to our information, they've filed multiple requests for visitation that were denied, the officer explained. They've been very worried about you. 2 hours later, the Tower of London Visitor Centre had been temporarily converted into a quiet space where Ryan could speak with child protection specialists. Edward had been formally relieved of ceremonial duties for the remainder of the day. A technical requirement following his breach of protocol, though his commanding officer's brief nod had communicated approval rather than censure. The visitor centre doors opened to admit an elderly couple moving with urgent pace. The man, tall, with silver hair and Ryan's same green eyes, scanned the room frantically until he spotted his grandson. "Ryan!" he called out, his voice breaking. Ryan turned at the sound, his eyes widening in recognition. "Grandpa! Grandma!" What followed was a reunion that brought tears to the eyes of even the most seasoned professionals present. Ryan's body language transformed instantly, the defensive posture melting away as recognition triggered something primal and healing. He moved toward them with hesitant steps that quickly accelerated into a run, breaking 14 months of conditioned caution in a single moment of instinctive trust. "You're really here," he whispered, as his grandmother knelt to embrace him, her tears falling freely onto his hair. His grandfather, a retired military man himself, judging by his bearing, stood protectively over them both, one hand on Ryan's shoulder, his weathered face a complex map of relief, joy, and barely contained fury at his grandson's condition. Ryan's grandparents embraced him with gentle care for his injuries, but fierce, protective love that answered any questions about where he belonged, their bodies forming a protective circle that seemed to physically shield the boy from the world that had failed him. "We've been searching for you for months," his grandmother explained through tears, carefully stroking his hair away from his bruised face. "After your father died, then your mother." Elaine moved so quickly, and when we tried to visit, she always had excuses. "She said you didn't want me," Ryan whispered, the pain of this particular lie evident in his voice. "That nobody wanted me except her." "Nothing could be further from the truth," his grandfather stated firmly. "We've filed court papers, hired investigators. We never stopped looking for you." As the family embraced again, Edward moved to slip away quietly, his official role complete. He had nearly reached the door when Ryan's voice called out, "Guard Winslow!" Edward turned back to find Ryan watching him, still within his grandparents' protective embrace, but clearly unwilling to let his rescuer leave without acknowledgement. "Thank you," Ryan said simply, "for believing me." Edward crossed the room and knelt to Ryan's eye level, military bearing momentarily set aside as he addressed the boy directly. "It took tremendous courage to make that signal," Edward told him, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "The courage you showed today is the same courage that will help you heal." Ryan nodded solemnly, absorbing the words. "Will you get in trouble for breaking the rules?" A slight smile crossed Edward's face. "There are rules, and then there are duties," he replied. "Sometimes the highest duty requires breaking a rule." "We can never thank you enough," Ryan's grandmother said, tears streaming unashamedly down her face. Edward rose to his feet, military posture returning. "No thanks necessary, ma'am. Ryan did the hard part." He extended his hand formally to the boy. "It was an honor to be of service, young man." 1 week later, Edward Winslow stood at his post in the tower courtyard, red tunic gleaming in the summer sun, bearskin cap perfectly positioned, ceremonial stillness maintained with precision. Among the afternoon visitors, a boy with healing bruises but bright eyes walked between his grandparents, pointing excitedly as they approached Edward's post. Though protocol prevented any acknowledgement, Edward's eyes met Ryan's briefly, a silent communication between two people forever connected by one moment of courage. As they moved on, Ryan walked taller, his shoulders straight, his step lighter. No longer a victim, but a survivor beginning to heal. What would you do if you noticed signs of abuse in a child? Would you have the courage to intervene, even if it meant breaking from expected roles or risking personal consequences? How many children like Ryan might be saved if more people recognized the subtle signals of abuse and took action instead of looking away? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your perspective on the responsibility we all have to protect vulnerable children in our communities. If you found this story powerful, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more impactful Royal Guard stories that go beyond the ceremonial uniform. Don't forget to press the bell icon so you never miss our daily uploads. Share this video with someone who believes in standing up for those who cannot defend themselves, no matter the personal cost. Our previous videos are appearing on your screen right now. Check them out next to see more stories of duty, honor, and courage beyond the uniform. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time with another powerful story you won't want to miss. Until then, remember that sometimes the most important duty requires the courage to break protocol.